Welcome to Indus Special. I'm Ejaz Haider. In an interview Wednesday to a US newspaper, the New York Times, Prime Minister Imran Khan said that there was no point in talking to India. I mean, I've done all the talking. Unfortunately, now when I look back, all the overtures that I was making for peace and dialogue, I think they took it for appeasement. There's nothing more that we can do. Khan had spoken a day earlier with US President Donald Trump, apprising the latter of the situation developing in Indian-occupied and now annexed Kashmir. The area, saturated with nearly 800,000 occupation forces, has been under curfew and a total communications blackout since August 5th. Indian economist and Nobel laureate Amartya Sen has called the measure a typical colonial way of suppressing people. Genocide Watch has already issued a genocide alert with reference to occupied Kashmir. Khan, in his interview, once again likened the Modi government and the Hindutva ideology with Nazi Germany. Pakistan has also expressed fear that India would mount a false flag operation in occupied Kashmir to initiate hostilities. There is regular fire exchange between Pakistani and Indian troops across the line of control in Kashmir, and at least on one recorded occasion, India resorted to the use of cluster munitions, which are banned under an international treaty. Meanwhile, President Trump, who has talked about mediating between India and Pakistan at least 3 times within a month, will be meeting Modi on the sidelines of the G7 summit in France, scheduled to begin tomorrow. While India is not a member of the Group of 7, he has been invited to the meet by French President Emmanuel Macron to discuss what PM Khan said to the US newspaper and also the evolving situation between Pakistan and India. We are joined by Ms. Rabbani Khar, who is a former foreign minister of Pakistan, Ambassador Zamir Akram, who has been Pakistan's representative at the UN in Geneva, and also Lieutenant General Naeem Khalid Lodhi. Let me kick off with Ms. Khar. Ms. Khar, you've read the interview given by the Prime Minister. He said there's no point in talking to India. So that means talks or any kind of dialogue is off the table, at least for the near future. Is that reading correct?
Of course. I mean, he's pretty much said it, and I am surprised that what we could all see as a writing on the wall in terms of what Modi's, first of all, vote bank is, what his mandate was, and what were his intentions, not based on any sort of fictitious opinion about him, but based on his 5 years in power as Prime Minister. We could all see it coming. I mean, one knew that this is a man who is going to appease. The very astounding mandate that he got was to be an extremist. He won the election. He implemented his agenda in phase 1 of his of being in power, and the next time around, his ideology, his agenda, his manifesto talked about extremism. And what is happening right now, and I think what is not quite visible to the world in its reaction to India, because I understand organizations, New York Times, Financial Times, all of these editorials, all of that is happening. UN organizations taking notice of it, Human Rights Watch taking notice of it. This is going to happen because the extent of the abuse, both legally and human rights, is far, far, far over even what we've developed in appetite for, right? That is happening. But what is not happening, the reaction that you do not see bilaterally to a changing India, is because India today is actually benefiting from the fruits of the secular India as built in its constitution and as promoted, propagated by people like Nehru, who also did lots of excesses, but still, at least the pretense of a secular India. Manmohan Singh, even Vajpayee, who happened to be BJP, but was really a peace builder, was really a statesman. So India today is living through that, is living the fruits of that reputation. And the reality of Modi's India, a fanatic, extremist India which has no space for minorities, which is on a genocide mission, which is going to use rape, pellet guns as state policy, to literally exterminate people almost as a mission, and is going to allow lynching, etc., to happen on streets, and the government is going to look the other way. This India is slowly and steadily, I think it's the reputation or the reality of this new India is slowly and steadily sinking into the world's capitals. However, I still feel, as things were, it's going to be a while, I would say 5 to 10 years, before India starts living, the repercussions of what it is doing on the ground today.
Okay, you partly preempted my question because I've known you and your work as the foreign minister to be a rational, moderate, a person who looked at diplomacy as one of the key ways in which one could reach a cooperative framework. For someone like you to also that Modi's extremism is something that is unlikely to create that kind of cooperative framework. So in which case, my question to you would be that if you were to formulate a strategy at this point in time, something that you did when you were the foreign minister, what would be the salient features of that strategy?
Possibly 3 objectives that the government of Pakistan, GOP, could be looking at right now. One is that you want to go back to a pre-370 status quo, okay, which is that Kashmir is disputed territory. Half the world recognizes it as disputed, half the world doesn't, but there are the UNSC resolutions. Modi is doing what he's doing in Kashmir, and status quo exists, and we keep on making noise about it. Okay, so this is the pre-370 change by Modi position, a status quo. The other objective could be that because this is, for Modi, I believe, it's like shooting yourself on the foot, because he has actually managed to do what no Pakistani in the last 20 years has been able to do, which is internationalize the Kashmir dispute, internationalize the Kashmir problem, and really bring the focus, the floodlights right now, at least for the time being. I don't think this will be sustainable, but right now the floodlights are on Kashmir. Kashmir is getting world attention, right? And also created the nuclear flashpoint, created a lot of attention.
No, but let me interject here. How has this been internationalized in the sense that France and Germany and Britain, they've all been saying that this is a bilateral, although they're saying that, you need to talk, they're actually pressing India to talk, but they're saying this is bilateral.
I'll tell you very simply. I was very disturbed also by the Sri Lankan statement which has just come out, which is basically negating what our High Commissioner over there has said. And I think that's extremely important, because in policy making and in the articulation of our meetings, we have to be very sure that we are never negated by a person that we're quoting. I will tell you how I believe it has been internationalized. Within the UN, this was the first time after 1965, I believe, that it was on the UNSC agenda. Yes, in a form that is perhaps not ideal, but it was there.
Informal, closed door, there was no statement, there's no consensus.
I would look very deeply, and I would think very deeply before I would make a choice to go into any of these structures, right?
Correct.
But when you look at the UN organizations, okay, the UN Human Rights Watch, others like that, and you just mentioned the Genocide Watch, this is. And, of course, I mentioned editorials. I'm not talking about news reports. I'm talking about editorials in New York Times. I'm talking about editorials in Financial Times. So to that extent, this issue has been internationalized, which wasn't being internationalized. So it was considered to be, okay, Modi is doing this in Assam, and now Modi is doing that in Kashmir, almost equation. Right now, no. The Kashmir problem, because when people write about Kashmir, they write about the 1948 resolutions. They write about the fact that the British went out without solving this problem, right? So it has been. So I was coming to what could be Pakistan's second objective, which is that in this, you try and find an opportunity to try and find a just and peaceful resolution for the people of Jammu and Kashmir, period, okay, which has been our stance from the beginning. And the third could be that, okay, let's make a lot of noise, let's create a lot of hoo-ha, and then learn to live with the new status quo. So I would have chosen the second option. In having chosen the second option, the first thing I would have done is hire, and I know this has been your view also, hire a panel, not one single, but a panel of international law experts. Okay, because you see, even if you have a small legal dispute with your neighbor, and you go to 3 different lawyers, they will give you 3 different opinions. We need a world-acclaimed, or at least a really good panel of international law experts who guide you whether and how to go to the ICJ, what are the pros, what are the cons, whether one should go in what way to the UNSC, and how are we likely, shall we ever go for a resolution? I believe the resolutions that we have, we cannot do better than that. So
I did a program yesterday on this question, and our determination was that India has actually attached a rider to the Genocide Convention Clause 9, I think, if I remember correctly, which essentially means that there's a jurisdictional issue here in terms of taking the case to the ICJ, because without India's consent, the ICJ will not be able to adjudicate the matter. But I agree with you that before we formulate a strategy, we need to essentially determine what the objectives are. That was Hina Rabbani, Khar, former Foreign Minister of Pakistan, speaking with us. Let's now go to Ambassador Akram. We shall also be joining shortly by Lieutenant General Naeem Khalid Lodhi. He should be with us in a few moments. Ambassador Akram, you heard the former Foreign Minister, Ms. Khar. Are we pursuing a strategy by actually first understanding and appreciating what the objectives are?
I think so. I think that we are very clear about what our objectives should be. And I don't think our objective should be to internationalize the issue. The Indians have already done that. But our actual effort should be to move the situation towards an eventual solution of the Kashmir dispute, which admittedly will take a long time. It will be a long haul. But we need to prepare for this from now, because I don't know how a lot of other people think, but in my own opinion, I think Mr. Modi has created a problem for himself. He has taken steps that have brought international attention to this issue. But let's be really realistic about it. International attention can be transitory, and also I don't see the international community, the UN or the Human Rights Council, or even the major countries in the world using compellence against India to force it to change, to force Mr. Modi to change his approach. What is going to happen? What will change Mr. Modi's approach is going to be more pain for India in occupied Kashmir. And for that, we need to be able to help the Kashmiri resistance, the Hurriyat, to sustain its movement for self-determination. That's the key point as far as I'm concerned in helping Kashmiris in the world.
Without prejudice to what you're saying, Ambassador Akram, what exactly do you mean by pain for India? Because the way this entire thing is unfolding, it's clear to most of us that the Indian state is now very clear about the fact that it will crush any protests, any groundswell of resistance. Now, most of what we have seen has been unarmed resistance, people pelting stones, getting blinded, injured, arrested, tortured. This thing is going to get worse. So how would you define pain for India?
Pain, I mean the inability of the Indian state to enforce its will through the use of force and even extreme use of force, as we will see taking place now. What has happened is that Mr. Modi's action has alienated all the Kashmiris, even those who were with India in the past, the Sheikh Abdullahs and the Mehbooba Muftis and the rest of them. They have also now condemned what Modi has done. So the level of resistance, the level of reaction is going to be unprecedented. And this is, in my view, something that the Indian state will not be able to sustain in India, keeping in mind the fact that the Indian government, Mr. Modi's government, is also engaged in unleashing a campaign against its own minorities, and the Muslim minorities in particular. So this kind of divisive politics in India, in my view, is unsustainable over the long term.
But the question is, and I will come back to you, Ambassador Akram, with this question, but I just won't leave it on the table. It depends on how deftly we can exploit these fault lines. But let me go to General Lodhi here. General Lodhi, as a military officer, are you familiar with the phrase that you need to appreciate the situation, not situate the appreciation? Given what India has done and given how we are reacting to it, are we appreciating the situation or situating the appreciation?
As far as I understand, Indians have acted in 4 distinct areas. They have acted in the political domain where they have changed the status of that, Indian occupied Kashmir, which is a big political coup, if I should say that. They have acted in the legal frame that they have covered this, this political step by carrying out some legal formalities. We are aware of that. They have acted in the diplomatic domain to counter us everywhere and to make sure that the statements coming out are not very damaging for them. And fourthly, they have also acted in the military domain. Now, they have acted in 4 domains. And if you keep on circling to one domain, which is the diplomatic, and that too is not coming very forcefully in your favor, because whatever statement came from the Security Council, I think that was not enough. And most of the countries are saying we are concerned about the situation in Kashmir, and we expect that both the countries, they resolve the issue, not realizing that one country has tried its best to resolve the issue, and the other country is not listening to this one country, as our Prime Minister has also said. First in February, once their planes, they crossed the LOC and even the international border. And secondly, now once they've changed the status. So whether we should have revoked Simla agreement, citing that Indians have actually violated it and it stands nullified automatically. We have not done that. Secondly, we could have asked UN to carry out partial plebiscite in the areas which are administered by Pakistan, so that the world knows that what percentage of people of Kashmir are actually wanting to go on which side. We have not done anything on. I don't know whether it is good or bad.
Finally, I'm so happy that you have said this, General Lodhi, because I don't think I thought I was the only one who was talking about this partial plebiscite issue, but I'm really grateful that you've said this, and I think that's a very important point. And I also totally agree with you with reference to Shimla, because India's unilateral changing of the status quo goes directly against the Shimla Agreement, the text of the Shimla Agreement itself. So, yes, the legal, the political, the diplomatic, but then the 4th domain of the military. I want you to tell me how we can counter that.
Okay. Once we talk of military actions, it does not really mean that you go for all-out attack. There are so many other options, and I will discuss that. But first, let me emphasize that Indians, they have taken a military action by pumping a lot of military in that area. Rather, I would say that even more than required, because there's a optimum ratio, troop to space ratio, which I think they have exceeded, which actually goes in our favor if we really want to exploit it. And secondly, they have carried out a very heavy clampdown on that small area and totally blacked out. And in my own assessment, whatever is going on is not really known to us.
Genocide Watch has already issued a genocide alert. I talked about it yesterday in my program. And it's very interesting, General Lodhi, that if you go to the Genocide Watch website, there is a genocide alert with reference to occupied Kashmir, and then there is a genocide watch in relation to Assam, both areas under the control of India, which calls itself the world's largest democracy. But let me go back to Ambassador Akram. Ambassador Akram, General Lodhi has come up with this, and I talked about this, a couple of weeks ago on my program in relation to, the areas that we control, have a plebiscite there and get the UN to monitor it. Do you think that is something which would be an innovative way of creating a huge sort of moral legal contrast between what Indians have done in occupied Kashmir and what we are doing or we can likely do in these areas?
You know, Ejaz, when I was in government, when I was in the Foreign Office, we have considered these options. And I personally think that this is a viable option. This is something that we should do. And I personally have supported it in the past. And we can do this with the constitutional provision that the final status will be determined once the Kashmiris, the whole of Jammu and Kashmir, have had the opportunity to decide. So we can do this. It's doable. The only counter argument so far has been that this will undermine our case vis-a-vis the whole of Jammu and Kashmir, and the Indians could use it to negate any dialogue on Kashmir in the future. But now that they have taken this step of virtually annexing Kashmir illegally, I think this is an option that should be brought back on the table, and we should seriously consider something like this in consultation with the people of Azad Jammu and Kashmir and with the people of Gilgit-Baltistan.
The other thing that General Lodhi said, and again I find myself in agreement with him, the status of Shimla agreement right now, considering that India's action has unilaterally changed the status quo.
I don't think that we should unilaterally abrogate the Simla agreement. That would be seen as an irresponsible step. We want to be in a position to be able to project India and the Modi government as being irresponsible. And we have done that quite effectively. And now it is India that needs to prove to the international community that it will be able to, or is prepared to act in a responsible way. So throwing Simla out of the window isn't really going to change materially the situation on the ground. What we need to do is up the ante and take a more proactive approach towards supporting the Kashmiri freedom movement through supporting a political mass movement in occupied Jammu and Kashmir against the Indian occupation. I think that is what our focus, that our objective should be. Ultimately, the Indians will need to recognize this and will need to come to the negotiating table to find a solution.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Naeem, Khalid, Lodhi, Ambassador Zamir Akram, for speaking with us. We'll take a short break and at the other end discuss the growing row between South Korea and Japan, two close US allies whose relations continue to be marred by history. Stay with us. Welcome back to Indus Special. In a move bitterly criticized by Japan, South Korea announced on Thursday that it will scrap an intelligence sharing pact with Tokyo. Seoul's decision not to extend the General Security of Military Information Agreement shows how the political and trade dispute between the Asian neighbors, both close US allies, has hit some of the region's most sensitive security issues. The agreement was due for automatic renewal on Saturday. The arrangement was designed to share information on the threat posed by North Korea and its missile and nuclear activities, a threat underlined by the North's recent launch of a series of short-range ballistic missiles. South Korea's Kim Yoo-geun, a deputy director of the Presidential National Security Council, said Japan had created a quote-unquote grave change in the environment for bilateral security cooperation by removing South Korea's fast-track export status this month. Under this situation, we have determined that it would not serve our national interest to maintain an agreement we signed with the aim of exchanging military information which is sensitive to security. For his part, the US Secretary of State Mike Pompeo told reporters in Canada that we are disappointed to see the decision the South Koreans made about that information sharing agreement. We are urging each of the two countries to continue to engage. Before the signing of the agreement in 2016, under US pressure, South Korea and Japan shared intelligence through the United States. South Korea went ahead with the deal at the time despite opposition from some political parties and a large section of the public who remained bitter over Japan's actions during its colonial rule of Korea from 1910 until the end of World War II. A 2012 attempt to seal the deal fell apart in the face of opposition in South Korea toward military cooperation with Japan. To discuss tensions between Seoul and Tokyo, we have with us Dr. Harvey Dzoden, who's based in Beijing, and also Professor Stephen Nagy, who joins us from Tokyo. Let me begin with Professor Nagy here. Professor Nagy, history seems to just not leave people and nations. So the ghosts of that colonial rule still, shall I say, rule the roost. Do you think that is the main reason, and that South Korea, and if Japan were to offer that apology, that things could actually move in the right direction?
First and foremost, I think we should understand that the rejection or the decision by the South Koreans to not renew the GSOMA agreement is not only a sign that it's very dissatisfied with the relationship with Japan, but it's a decision to prioritize giving Japan a bloody nose and damaging the U.S. ROK, the South Korean military alliance. In reality, the United States has worked very hard to try and bring Japan and South Korea together to form a security cooperation network in Northeast Asia to push back against North Korea, but also in the long term to be able to mitigate China's rise. And South Korea has made a very deliberate decision, in particular the Moon administration, to use history and as a political card to consolidate political support domestically. And the best way to do that is to bring up history and Japan's colonial past. And this is a tragedy because the previous president, President Park Geun-hye, did make a courageous decision to come to an agreement with Prime Minister Abe and Japan over the Comfort Women Agreement, as well as other issues. And I think that this is a tragedy for Japan-South Korean relations, but it's a real demonstration that the South Koreans don't prioritize that U.S.-South Korean alliance.
Yeah, I think, would you agree that this is also a sort of knee-jerk reaction to the Japanese move to, ban the fast-track exports for South Korea?
I think it's an emotional decision, but it's not, the South Korean government, successive governments have had a long and established track record of basically rejecting agreements that have been made at the leadership level. And, President Moon is the latest in a series of South Korean presidents who basically said, well, we're going to reject the previous administration's agreements and progress with the Japanese, and we're going to prioritize a politicized relationship to, prioritize, in this case for the Moon administration, reunification with the North, but also trying to get some political support for a failing economy.
Okay. Dr. Dzoden, this trade issue is to be fairly sensitive for South Korea at a time when, as you recall, the trilateral meeting, the foreign ministers of China, Japan, and South Korea, South Korean exports to China are also falling. They've fallen by 20%. And then there's generally, in terms of South Korea's total exports for the first 20 days of August, have fallen by 13% from a year earlier. The exports of semiconductors has also fallen. So there's a crunch of sorts that Seoul is feeling. Now, given that, the Japanese move probably hurt South Korea even more, and then, of course, as I said, history kicks into play, and Seoul decided to take this measure, which obviously is being criticized by the U.S. also, experts also, by Japanese also, and incidentally, some in South Korea also.
I believe that this is a terrible situation coming at a terrible time. I believe that this has little to do with trade, but has a lot to do with what Dr. Nagy talked about in terms of the history of the two countries. And it comes at an unfortunate time when there's a lot of action with negotiations, but also with development of nuclear weapons and delivery systems in North Korea. So I think it's a terrible thing coming at the worst possible moment.
But would you agree that, these countries, and, I'd also include China in this, have had very bitter histories among them? And currently, if Japan and South Korea find themselves on one side of the equation, which is, of course, the alliance led by the United States, that does not really paper over that historical bitterness. And it will obviously pop up as it has popped up. And this at a time when there's been the North Korean missile launches. So do you think the U.S. will be able to somehow get the two sides together and work out some kind of modus vivendi?
You know, the question is, when can they be brought back together? Because we need cohesion now, not in 1 or 2 or 3 years from now. The problem really is, I believe, a direct result of President Trump's America first, everybody else last policy. I believe that there seems to be little interest to try to bring these two allies together. And let's face it, these two allies plus the United States form a tripartite set of allies. I would say if times were normal, they would have worked this out already, because the United States would have bashed heads together. But because the United States is pulling back from a lot of international commitments at the moment, all Pompeo could say was that they were very concerned and basically that they were sorry. This is now not how a great engaged power acts.
That's an interesting thought. Back to Professor Nagy. Professor Nagy, is there a possibility at a time when under President Trump, it's mostly about America first, and at least the traditional blob inside the Beltway has constantly been talking about the fact that Trump is taking the U.S. away from the kind of multilateral security architecture that the U.S. created post-Second World War, and which has always redounded to America's advantage, that America is losing its grip on its allies and tensions continue to arise. Now, given that situation, do you think Washington is in a position to actually get Tokyo and Seoul to come together, or tell Tokyo to perhaps reconsider the trade step that they took, and then get Seoul to walk back its talk about the security arrangement, intelligence sharing arrangement?
So that's a lot of different questions, but I'll try to break it down into different levels. So I think when we look at the Washington equation, we have the current president of the United States, President Trump, and then we have the establishment, those policymakers with long-term experience within the region, people like Michael Green and Victor Cha. These individuals have a deep and very thick relationship with and understanding of the region, and they view things very differently. President Trump is not a proponent of alliances, and he's made that very clear for the past 6 years, where the people within the institutions, they're doing everything they can to try and keep these institutional ties thick and deep and frequent. And we have this huge tension, and I think South Korea's rejection of the JSOMA not only will embolden Mr. Trump to reject alliance politics, but it's also going to be a blow to the confidence of those people within the institutions that are doing everything they can to try and keep the extremes of President Trump from becoming a reality. Within Japan, I think that there's real apology fatigue with dealing with the South Koreans, and they really feel that every successive new administration within the Blue House will just renege on previous agreements. So they just don't know what to do. And this is a widespread belief in the politic community as well as the business community amongst citizens. And in the South Korean context, they've really taken on this anti-Japanese sentiment after Prime Minister Abe has curbed or slowed the import of particular products that affect their South Korean blue chip companies, and they're labeling this as the Japanese trying to re-exert imperial or colonial influence. So there's a lot of pieces to this puzzle, but it goes back to Washington, and the President of the United States needs to exert leadership, and in this particular case, he's not.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. That was Professor Nagy speaking with us from Tokyo. We're also joined by Ross Feingold, who is an expert in legal and regulatory matters, especially as they impact the financial industry. Mr. Feingold joins us from Taipei. Mr. Feingold, thank you for being on the program. We're talking about the row between Seoul and Tokyo. Of course, there's a lot of history and historical bad blood. But perhaps you could inform us of how much of this has got to do with Tokyo's decision to basically scrap the fast-track export arrangement for South Korea.
Certainly the decision with regard to exports has heightened tensions, and it's accelerated what was really an accumulated number of issues, especially given government change that occurred in South Korea when the previous president was replaced due to her corruption. The current government, a lot of the people served in government under a previous left-of-center president in the early 2000s, and the policies that they have with regard to both North Korea and Japan are very similar. So they've brought back many of the same people and some of the same policies that revisit a lot of the unresolved historical issues. And for that, they shouldn't necessarily be criticized. It does reflect a large segment of the popular feeling in Korea that Korea should do more to bring these issues to Japan's attention, and that Japan hasn't done enough to address these historical issues. And I think people around the world could realize that. But on the other hand, we see the Prime Minister of Japan is also right of center, and he's also very nationalistic, and he's not going to just give in to demands that South Korea's current government makes with regard to some of these historical issues. And then there's the North Korea aspect, where Japan has been left out as South Korea.
I agree with you, Mr. Feingold, but here's the thing. I mean, as it happened, I was in Seoul a couple of months ago, and I came across these protests before the Japanese embassy, you know, the entire thing about the comfort women problem that's been going on for such a long time. But despite all these historical sort of simmering tensions, things were kind of, you know, going forward. But then this trade thing happened, and since you're an expert in this area, give us a sense of why South Korea's economy, you know, especially the electronics and exports, is disproportionately exposed to the U.S.-China trade war, and then Tokyo's decision comes in. So Seoul really is in a bind at the moment.
Well, we see a lot of positioning, right? Various countries, whether it's in bilateral trade discussions or multilateral trade discussions, they're trying to position themselves to get a better deal amid a very rapidly changing environment for international trade, whether it's tariffs or other type of barriers that impact the flow of goods, not just here in Asia, but around the world. And sometimes these moves against a bilateral partner are actually made with a third-party trading partner in mind. So South Korea's policies vis-a-vis Japan, or Japan's policies vis-a-vis South Korea, they might also not just be with bilateral considerations in mind, but with a broader multilateral or other bilateral trade negotiations in mind as well. So one could say that a lot of this was sparked by Donald Trump's policies. He withdrew the United States from the TPP on his first day in office, and that would have bound a lot of trading partners in Asia closer together with the United States. And ever since then, leaders have been forced to do what they think is necessary to get a better deal. And there's going to be fallout that results from that. And we see some of that, not just with the current disagreements between South Korea and Japan, but in any number of other trade disagreements. I'm speaking from Taiwan, for example, where Japan and Taiwan have a number of disputes over trade. Taiwan has disputes over trade with the United States. South Korea has disputes with other trading partners. So it's an environment where countries are looking for an advantage in negotiations, and there's not necessarily easy solutions to that, similar to the historical issues where there are no easy solutions.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. That was Ross Fuld speaking with us. Before I wrap up, back to Dr. Dzoden. Dr. Dzoden, given your experience, what is the requirement here for Washington, for the Trump administration to go back to the tried and tested multilateralism, where the U.S. could lead and not just pull back and start talking about bilateralism, allowing all these sort of, various historical tensions to, simmering tensions to actually conflagrate?
President Trump, for all his history, not only as president, but as a businessman who was quite in the public eye, has always hated multilateralism and globalization. He treats them as evils. So he's not going to move back to that model. He's going to work bilaterally, country by country, and he's going to try to tear down all the multilateral institutions, whether it's the UN or WTO or whatever, because he doesn't believe in them. So he's really wreaked a lot of havoc. And even if President Trump is thrown out of office next year, the damage he's done will be hard to repair in the short term. I do believe, however, that the United States has a better chance of re-entering the international system, but it will never be at the strength it was before Trump. Irreversible damage has been done, but I think it's really necessary to get back to that if we're going to move forward in a 21st century world.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. That was Dr. Harvey Dzoden speaking with us from Beijing. This is all for this week from Indus Special. We shall see you next week. Until then, it's goodbye.